Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Wednesday, April the 3rd, 2024. We're looking at this past Sunday's Gospel reading, Mark 16, 1 through 8, actually the whole chapter of Mark 16, because as I only briefly mentioned in the sermon, there was a couple of other endings added onto it beyond verse 8, a shorter ending and a longer ending. We're going to talk about that today and also tomorrow. I kind of introduced the idea yesterday with talking about a couple of movies. One called The Four Daughters that ended kind of tragically with the John Garfield character dying. So when they reworked it a number of years later in the early 50s into a musical starring Frank Sinatra, they let him miraculously recover. And in much the same way, another movie from the 50s, 1950 exactly, called Young Man with a Horn, was based on a real-life story of a great jazz a trumpet player in the jazz age of the 20s who died tragically, but of course with Kirk Douglas, the big star, and making it into a movie with Doris Day. Interestingly enough, she was in the remake of Four Daughters, the Young at Heart movie. She was also in The Young Man with a Horn, just as an aside. Kirk Douglas had to miraculously recover at the end of that movie because you want a happy ending. We like endings. We like happy endings, and particularly we like endings that aren't ambiguous. And of course, as I talked at some length on Sunday, it's kind of an ambiguous ending in Mark 8. And I said, tacked onto that, there's what's called the shorter ending. Usually doesn't have any verses to it, assigned to it, and then a longer ending, which is verses 9 through 20, but that's usually in brackets with some kind of a footnote in our Bible saying that this longer ending isn't found in all the manuscripts. And we're going to talk real quick about that. Just, it's a fascinating subject. We'll probably spend a lot of time with this. Just kind of the Cliff Notes version. If you could imagine, I was running things off here, just some notes for today's daily devotion. And of course, I could just like click a button and it would be copied off. Imagine, in those first centuries that everything was written by hand and you didn't go to the Xerox machine, the copier, whatever. Somebody else had to take that first writing and in order to make a copy of it, word by word, line by line, page by page, had to copy it. And so what sometimes would happen is that there were differences. So we have ancient manuscripts dating, we don't have the original ones, but we have manuscripts from the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, particularly from the 4th century and beyond. And there's differences, and some are more reliable than others. In some cases, and it was typically monks who did this, these scribes, they would be copying it down. Sometimes they would get drowsy, if it was cold and dark, and maybe they would copy a line twice, or they would leave something out, or also quite commonly what would happen is they would say, oh, this doesn't sound right, and they would kind of harmonize it. And we're going to see in just a few moments how this is probably true. They'll bring in verses that they thought are missing in this case, we're talking about Mark, bring in verses from maybe some of the other Gospels that will help make more sense and provide a better ending. I'll say more about that in just a minute. But I want to talk first about that short reading, or that short ending, I should call. And it appears in many of our Bibles, and it simply says this: and all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter, and afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Kind of like a big statement, just kind of wrap everything up. The problem with that, as has been pointed out, is it's often placed after verse 8. And if it was, a short ending, the problem with it is that it appears to contradict what we just heard in verse 8. In other words, verse 8 ends, so they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then it goes on to say, but all that had been commanded them, they briefly told to those around them. That doesn't seem to match up. It just seems to be sort of tacked on there to kind of summarize it up somehow. Just the idea of the women running and being afraid wasn't satisfying enough for them. So that's the short ending. It seems pretty obvious that that was probably added on later. And then we have the longer ending. That's verses 9 through 20. And let me read that. Now he rose early on the first day of the week. He appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him, and they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. And after this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country. They went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they'll cast out demons, they'll speak in tongues, they'll pick up snakes in their hands, and if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." And so then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, and was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them, confirmed the message by the signs that had accompanied it. So a lot of stuff there. And we're going to stop there today, except to say that maybe some of those things sound familiar to you. If you have a chance between today and tomorrow, read verses 9 through 20. And then look at the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke and John, and see if some of these verses in Mark 16, 9 through 20, that is, sound like something you may have heard in one of the other 3 Gospels, because it's definitely there. And if you stop and think about it and compare, it'll become apparent to you. And we'll take a little bit of time. There's, again, a lot to say here. I'm trying to summarize it as briefly as I can, but in a way that makes sense. So basically, to sum up, that shorter ending obviously was just tacked on, just kind of a summary statement. It doesn't even get verses. It probably it comes out of some manuscripts that come out of, actually, from Egypt or Ethiopia, I think it was. Not a lot of the most well-known manuscripts, and I'll say a little bit about that tomorrow as well. Then you have 9 through 20. I will say this much, that the manuscripts that end at verse 8, which again, scholars today especially believe that was the original ending, the earliest, best manuscripts that we have and they're only from the 4th century, though that's where they end. The ones that have the longer ending come from the 5th century and beyond, which is sort of interesting in and of itself, if they were, again, later additions to the original gospel. And then there's also a theory that the real ending is not verse 8, it's not even including 9 through 20, but it's something else that was lost. And I'll say just a word about that as well. So until tomorrow, that's a lot to think about. But again, it's fascinating, and I'm enjoying sharing a little bit of this with you. Until tomorrow, then, take care. Bye.